Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Gulf Coast Garden. We have a great program for you this morning. We have a few houses. The program always goes so much better whenever everyone turns off their video and mutes their mic. We also have a couple of programming updates for you. In 2 weeks, there will not be a program on September 1st, but 2 weeks after that, on September 15th, we have a terrific presentation from Ginger Smith on landscaping with natives. So be sure and sign up for that and tune in with that. So with all of that said, we think you're going to enjoy this morning's program. Our guest speaker is David Oates, who is the CEA for horticulture from Jefferson County, and he's going to as alternatives to traditional lawns. So I think it'll be great. So sit back, relax, and thank you for allowing us to bring you your horticulture education. Over to you, David.
All righty. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate the introduction. Kevin, did you hit record? So we'll be sure to record this for those guys as well.
Yes, I did.
Awesome. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. So again, thank you guys for joining us this morning. This morning, we're going to talk about some ground covers. And I call this alternative to lawns, simply because there's always a spot in our yard or our landscape where we always have that one area that just is not conducive maybe to growing grass. Maybe it's a raised bed or maybe a little container area that just is not easy to get a lawnmower in and out. And you want something that is low fuss, no maintenance, or some maintenance anyway. And maybe you just want something different other than just your traditional, acre and a half of grass that you have to mow. So that's really what we're going to talk about on ground covers this morning. Kind of the good and the bad and the ugly on ground covers, because there are some drawbacks to some ground covers that most people don't think about, but we'll talk about some of those as well. We're going to talk mainly the first little few minutes about ground covers, how they grow, where they grow, and then we'll talk about some requirements, sun or shade, and then maybe from initial planting. And then at the end, we'll kind of go through some pictures of some ground covers that are really good choices, maybe for mainly the Southeast Texas area. I tried to keep these pretty specific, talking about our upper Gulf Coast region. Now, if you're listening from an area maybe further out, there may be some different types of ground covers that we didn't list and discuss, but we can always talk about those as well. So we'll go ahead and get started. Again, if you do have questions, just hit the chat box, and I think Kevin will do a good job on popping those up and interrupting me. But we'll go from there. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And basically, this is going to talk, just like I said, about ground covers and how they are and kind of where we can use them and kind of go from there. So here we go. All right. So I just want to start out first talking about ground covers in general. And I always like to give a definition on ground covers or whatever I'm talking about. I have found that probably is the easiest way to get started. Because if we just jump into it, talking about something else, people kind of get lost. So basically, my definition of a ground cover, as you can see, hopefully you can see it on the screen there. Ground covers are just a low-growing plant that simply cover the ground instead of turf. That's a pretty generic term, and I did include low-growing. Again, your definition of low-growing and my definition may be a little bit different, but I'm thinking about 2 to 2.5 feet or lower may be considered a ground cover for some places, and in some instances it may only be 12 to 15 inches. So we really just kind of depending on what you're growing is what you can call a ground cover. But as long as it covers the ground and you don't have to weed it as much, then I would call it a ground cover. So it's a pretty broad term, but again, just a low growing plant that covers the ground instead of our traditional grass. I always like to say that the ground covers serve 3 basic purposes in a landscape. Number 1 is to help fill in a bare spot in the landscape. And again, if you've got an area that is not accessible to a lawnmower or a weed eater, or it's just a high maintenance area that you just don't really want to mess with, that would require too much maintenance, or consider it a bare spot in the landscape, you can put in a ground cover there. Number 2, helps to prevent erosion of soil on steep slopes and embankments. That is a really good option for ground covers, because a lot of ground covers like to creep and crawl and cover a hillside or maybe a slope very well. So if you have a embankment or a slope of some sort, definitely a ground cover will be a good option instead of trying to get a lawn grass established, because if you try to mow or weed eat a steep slope, you're going to set yourself up for failure, either through erosion or maintenance. I think maintenance would be the big thing on that one. So a steep slope or a hillside with a ground cover that maybe only need to be trimmed occasionally might be a good option. And the last one is to fill in shady locations under trees where other plants may have difficulty growing due to shaded locations. Now, with that being said, you've got lots of shade. That is going to limit your choices of ground cover, obviously. Some ground covers require full sun to be productive. Others need moderate sun or filtered shade and or sun. So if you have a very dense shady location, you're going to be limited as to what types of ground cover you can use. But traditionally, if it's an excessively shady location, you may want to consider a ground cover if you cannot have enough sunlight for traditional grass to grow. I think I run into that a lot of cases with homeowners, because they say, they'll tell me, well, I've got, a couple of trees, and you look at their lot or their, landscape, and a few trees turns into 10 or 12 trees, and there's no sunlight. So we have to either, number one, open up that canopy on trees to get some more sunlight in there, or we have to think about another option instead of the traditional lawn grass, and the ground covers would fit that bill. So depending on your location and how much shade you have will dictate how much shade and the shade quality and the type of plants that you can grow. All right, so we kind of lump ground covers into three broad categories, and this is a very generic grouping, but this is what you're primarily going to see. Number one is we see what we call a broadleaf evergreen. And basically, for ease of remembrance, they basically retain their leaves on a year-round basis. So they never go bare. They stay green year-round. And I think that's what most people like to see, because it does give you some color throughout the year. If you do not want that, then there are some other different types of, ground covers that we can talk about. But a broadleaf evergreen is going to keep its leaves, on that plant majority of the year. Now, they may shed and then come back and put a new crop on, but for the most part, yes, they are going to stay green year-round. The second type is called deciduous evergreens, and just like our trees, they lose their leaves in cooler seasons in the wintertime. So if you're all right with having a deciduous type of evergreen ground cover, this may be your option. Like our trees, the time span here in the southeast part of the state is not that long, maybe 60 to 120 days at the most, but they definitely do drop their leaves, and they are bare during the cooler season and usually the wintertime season. The third type is what we call a coniferous, or a basically a cedar tree or something like that. That's what we usually think of, a coniferous type ground cover. And these are going to be, basically they have needle-like structures rather than our traditional leaves. So if you think of like a cedar tree or maybe a pine, something like that, that's going to be what we talk about that. The good thing about these guys is that there are a multitude of colors, usually from a blue-green to maybe a gray color, or maybe that green color that you really like. And they do maintain their color throughout the year. So if you are looking for something that's colorful, maybe on a slope or something like that, or an area where you're not needing a lot of maintenance, you may want to go with a type like this. So basically, three types of ground covers. You have your broadleaf evergreen, your deciduous, and then your coniferous as well. All right. So kind of really quick, why and where and why ground covers can be utilized. And we touched on this earlier, but basically, I would say anywhere in the landscape where grass is not suitable. And again, some examples that I put in here: too steep, too rocky, excess shade, or a shallow soil area. So too steep, if you can't safely, drive a lawnmower or push a lawnmower across it, it probably is pretty steep. Your only other alternative is to use a weed eater or some other type of trimmer, and that can be dangerous and or not safe. So that is why we normally use a ground cover on a hillside, because of the lack of maintenance. So a case in point example here that I can think of mine that, in my immediate area is here at Lamar College, just south of me here of downtown. There is basically a road that cuts right through the middle of campus, and they have basically a pitched road grading on either side of it that's fairly steep, steep enough that they can't use a mower to mow it. They could probably use a weed eater, but it's not feasible. So what they did instead was to plant ground cover along that embankment on either side of the road to keep it from washing. And basically use an Asian jasmine, and they, weed eat it about 2 or 3 times a year, just to kind of maintain it and keep it in check. But cuts down on maintenance. They don't have to weed eat it, or they don't have to mow it, so it is a good alternative there. The other option of where to use it would be when something's too rocky. If you have a very rocky outcropping, you can use a ground cover as well. It may not give you 100% coverage, but it will, again, eliminate some of the maintenance issues that you may face with an area that is too rocky and you can't use a traditional mower in an area due to damage from the mower. Next one, we talk about shade, and I think this is where a lot of people think that they can do a ground cover. You have to be very careful when we talk about excess shade. If you have a courtyard or something like that that is maybe shaded on 3 sides and gets 2 hours of sunlight a day, you're going to be limited very quickly on what you can and cannot grow. Case in point, and another great example that I just popped in my mind is next door at our courthouse, there is a courtyard where the building kind of encroaches on 3 sides, and I think that courtyard gets about 2.5 hours of sunlight a day. It's very shady, 3-story building. It's almost like a little indoor courtyard, but it's not indoors. It just doesn't have any sunshine. And of course, St. Augustine grass will not grow there. They have tried to plant a few crepe myrtles in there, and they're very leggy and very spindly because they are trying to find that sunshine. But they do have some ground cover there, and that's the best that they can do with that area because it is such a shaded area. In fact, I think they have some Asian jasmine that is struggling, to say the least. And every time we walk over there, we look at it and we talk about it, and they don't want to change it, but they want it to be full and thick. But again, it's just kind of splotchy and got bald spots in it because of the shade. So think about that when we talk about excess shade. Ground covers are a good alternative, but you can have too much of a good thing, and I think the shade can be a problem if it's very shady as well. The fourth one says shallow soil areas. If you have an area that basically has very minimal topsoil and will not support a good quality lawn, this might be an area where you want to utilize a ground cover. Maybe you have an instance where you have a lot of tree roots that are very close to the surface, and mowing would not be feasible due to damaging the root system with a turf grass. You can basically bring in some topsoil a little bit to amend the area and interplant that area with a ground cover, and basically that ground cover will cover the area that you're in question, if it's a shallow soil area or something like that, and that way you do not damage the roots of a tree, for example. We see a lot of this with type of ground covers around the base of trees. You just have to be careful choosing the right type of ground cover that will not be aggressive or maybe try to climb the tree, so to speak. But anywhere where you may have roots on the surface or a very shallow soil area, that's where a ground cover would be utilized in its full effect. And then the next one says any location where lawn may not be desired. And I put this in here kind of where basically you don't want to have to put a lawnmower or a weed eater. Let's say you have a raised bed in a very formal garden, and maybe you have a water fountain and you don't want to plant annuals or perennials around it all the time. You can do a ground cover to fill in that area around that base of that fountain or something like that, where it is, again, less maintenance, but it is give you some color, things like that. Maybe you just want something different in the landscape rather than your traditional, lot with grass and then maybe 1 or 2 trees. There are many uses for a ground cover. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth here in just a few minutes. But I would say anywhere that you want an additional focal point or a visual interest, that's where you would use a ground cover, where maybe you've got an area that's kind of a rugged or natural setting, and you don't necessarily need, all the traditional lawn grass. That's where you would use a ground cover. And you can intermix different types of ground covers if you want to. A lot of times they're used in a larger setting where basically it's a mass planting of a ground cover where it basically draws your eye to it. So different locations, just have to really look at your landscape and see which one best suits your need. But again, it can be a focal point or maybe just an additional point of visual interest that you're highlighting, maybe a very specific tree that you have on that property. And you don't want to, get close enough to it to do some damage or something like that. So multiple uses for ground covers there. Okay, so this is my checklist for ground cover selection. Again, the ground cover may not be suited to every location, so you just have to go down a checklist and see that you hit most of the boxes listed below. And I always call it my selection checklist. Number one is soil type and quality. Normally, if you can have a lawn grass there, most likely you can have a good quality ground cover. But if you are in an area where there is rocky soil or something like that, maybe you have, tree roots that are, on the surface and grass just doesn't grow because it's so much of a hindrance there with your tree roots, you may have to switch over to a ground cover. So we talk about soil type and quality. Again, if you can grow a good turf grass, most likely you can grow any type of ground cover depending if it's, on your area. And I guess number two would kind of go along with this. Will this ground cover grow in my area? Make sure that the ground cover that you select is suited to your area. We're going to talk about some examples here in a few minutes of Southeast Texas type ground covers. I ordinarily would not recommend a ground cover that was suited to West Texas, to this area, because of all the rainfall. And in fact, you'll probably hear the thunder in the background. It's going to rain here at my location here in just a few minutes, I think. So, I don't want a ground cover that can tolerate very dry conditions, maybe in a flood prone area. Number three is this: how is this ground cover propagated? Do you do it by cuttings, or do you do it by sprigging it, or do you have to, how is it established or propagated? That can make a big difference when you're trying to cover an area. Then the next one says time frame to establish a dense covering and fill in the area. If you've got a huge area or a hillside that you're going to be planting, and you're going to plant it with little 4-inch sized transplants, it's going to take a while. You may want to consider bumping up to a 1 gallon type size on a ground cover. A lot of times they sell ground covers in 4-inch containers, which probably, if they're a fast grower, not an issue. But if you space them too far apart, it will take longer. And that kind of goes into our next question. It says, how tall and how large will this plant get at maturity? Most ground covers, depending on what they are, I would say, less than 12 inches. We're going to look at a couple that are definitely over the 12-inch range, maybe in the 24 to 2.5 foot range, but they're still a ground cover, but they're just an upright ground cover. Most of our ground covers that we plant have the spreading instinct where they basically will creep and crawl across the ground. Some ground covers do not. They grow upright instead of out and kind of along the ground. So you do have to know what type of ground cover you're going to try to fill in an area with. And that, again, how tall and how large will this plant get at maturity? If you're planting a ground cover that maybe gets tall, and you're trying to highlight a small, maybe a urn or a statue, something like that, you may actually obscure your urn or something like that, or your little water fountain, if you choose the wrong ground cover. So we do have to be mindful of how tall and how large this plant will get. Again, another thing to my selection checklist is how much does this plant cost? If it's a fairly common type of ground cover, your cost is not going to be outrageous. But if you're getting something that is very hard to root or it's a very exotic type of ground cover, you may be in for a sticker shock if you haven't been to the nursery recently. And most of us have, and we're just sitting there, scratching our heads. Plant material has almost doubled in the last year due to COVID and COVID-related issues. So be mindful of that. Once, if you used to pay, 65 cents for a little 4-inch pot, most times today it's probably going to be $1.50, $2 even. So be aware that plant material costs have gone up. And I know that's just, sticker shock like everything else here recently. But if that is the case, then you may want to think about either spacing those plants out further apart and waiting longer for them to get established, or you may want to reduce the size of your ground cover bed to start with. Sometimes a ground cover bed can be reduced in size and still benefit the area and do the purpose it was intended to. So just look at that. That's always something that we talk about, is a cost of plant material. And then again, the last one I think, which is most important, maintenance associated with this ground cover. Most people, when they plant ground covers, maintenance is not on the back of their mind. They don't even think about it. So we do have to think about it. Is this going to be a ground cover that you have to trim to keep it in shape or kind of keep it in bounds? Do you have to trim it each year, or does it need, special attention paid to it? Things like that. Most of the time, a ground cover is pretty low maintenance, or at least that's what I would like to call it. Is no maintenance is not feasible. If it is no maintenance, then it can get kind of wild and things like that. It might not do its intended program. So you do have to be sure and talk about the maintenance, whether it's once a year, twice a year, or every time you mow or something like that. So just take that into consideration, because if you're going to basically do more maintenance on a ground cover bed than you would a traditional lawn, then maybe that's not the right ground cover to use in your area. So just think about that, because maintenance, again, time and labor, those all things that. So that's a real quick checklist if you want to use a ground cover, and is it feasible in your location. All right. So for best results, let's say that we're going to already choose our ground cover and we know that we're going to use one. Number one, your ground cover should be adapted to the soil in which they are planted. Here in my part of the area of Southeast Texas, we do a lot more acidic-based type plantings because of our soil. We can amend our soils, obviously, wherever we're at, but anything that does good in our part of the world may not do good in West Texas, so to speak, or maybe North Texas. And I always put on here use of plant materials that will survive your region. The freeze that we had earlier this year was a good test of those plants. Plants like, I'm going to use Woodelia, for example. I know I thought mine was a goner this year in our area, but lo and behold, it's come back. It's more ferocious than it was last year. So I know that it will survive a cold temperature. Other plants such as Asian jasmine and things like that, no problems this far south. Maybe further north you go, they maybe have a little bit issue with some freeze damage. But in our area, those types of plants didn't miss a beat, and they did very good. You also want to look at the insect and the pest issue of a ground cover. Most ground covers are relatively free of insects and pests, and that's why we use them, basically because they are ease of maintenance. There may be a few plants here and there that may have some issues with pests or insects that may bother them. If that is a concern, and maintenance in that aspect is going to be cumbersome or labor intensive, you may want to change your mind and do a different type of ground cover. And then again, if I preach on this, y'all just probably get tired of me hearing it, but ease of maintenance after establishment. I'm kind of the mindset, and I know probably there's folks that, may just cringe when they hear this, but I'm going to say a lot of times ground covers need to be planted, plant it and forget it type attitude. In my landscape, in my yard, pretty much it's a you're on your own type of a landscape, and I hate to say that. So it's ease of maintenance after establishment. I will try to get that plant establishment. I'll give it a good start, but after 1 to 2 years, it better be pretty hardy, and it better like a lot of self-reliance, because a lot of times I'm the world's worst. I'll forget to water something even in my landscape, and I don't do a lot of maintenance other than just once or twice a year. So in my landscaping, for example, it is ease of maintenance after establishment, and that basically means you're going to get a little bit of attention here and there, but you better well be prepared for a rough travel in my landscape, because a lot of times it's kind of runs into some neglect and abuse, so to speak. But again, a lot of our ground covers can tolerate quite a bit of neglect, and that's, I think, where they really tend to shine, is that their ease of maintenance. All right, so let's talk real quick about ground cover planting. And I promise here in just a few minutes it'll get better. And we'll start looking at some pictures here in a few minutes. So consider the area to be covered by a ground cover. Again, most times ground covers is an alternative to our traditional centipede or St. Augustine lawns, for one specific reason. Again, we talk about a slope. If we are going to plant on a slope, you may have to put some additional topsoil. I see a lot of times that the highway department is planting things, doing some of these slopes where they have all the overpasses in our area now, and they are not too steep, but they're steep enough that they have to put down a ground cover. So they usually use a bark material, but a lot of times they'll bring in additional topsoil as well. The material that they build all these slopes with is usually a heavy clay, and it's not the best material for planting in. So they will amend some of these slopes with material, whether it be a compost, a peat moss, or other material that can be utilized. If you are having to do that, I would say incorporate those materials evenly into the soil of about 6-inch depth. Doing that on a slope may be a little bit of a challenge. You may have to do hand mixing on some of this, because if you're trying to do a tiller or a rototillering on a slope, that can be dangerous. So if it is hazardous, or for safety features, you may have to do it by hand if needed. But again, you may want to add some additional topsoil or organic material if it's needed on this slope. And again, sometimes the slope that you're trying to cover is just too steep and it's not feasible to do it. So just, look at it, and if it's safe, do it that way. Continuing on to ground cover planting, we talk about spacing. And again, it's just like installing a lawn. Most of us want that instant gratification with a lawn. So if we install a lawn, we normally lay it, edge to edge, where it's a solid green cover when we get through. And that's been the recent trend in the last 15 or 20 years. Growing up, I remember that no one ever put in a lawn in that format. It was always a checkerboard pattern, because it was so expensive. But as costs have kind of come down and they become more readily available, people are just going to spend the money and do it solid pattern. Ground covers are still kind of the old method, where they are not put in so close together that they give you that instantaneous look. But again, if you're doing a new installation of ground cover, they are usually spaced out, depending on the growth rate, anywhere from 12 to 15 inches on center. So you may have a gap in between those plants the first year where you installed them. An example might be Asian jasmine. If you're planting it in 4-inch pots or maybe a 1 gallon, you're going to basically work off of a grid pattern and hopefully get that installed where you know that it will cover in a year. But again, if you're trying to do it so close that it's going to be cost prohibitive, that may be what you need to look at as well. You also need to think about the growth rate of plants. If it's a fast grower, you can place them further apart. We talk about growth rate, depending on if it's a woody perennial or an annual, then it may cover very quickly. And again, we say this at the bottom: effective time required to fill in areas and have no bare spots. Realistically, 12 to 15 to 18 months is realistically for a ground cover to fill in from planting time to full coverage is what you're looking for. So figure out your spacing. Again, most of them are either 1 to 1 foot to 18 inches on center, and that gives you a pretty good fill rate, usually within 12 to 18 months of planting if it's the correct size. When we plant on slopes, and again, I've really focused on steep slopes because I think this is probably where most of us either fail or more damage may be incurred at the far end of the thing, and people may have to replant something like that. So if you do have a steep slope and you have issues with erosion, then yes, you're probably going to have to plant much closer together. Again, I'm going to use the highway departments as an example. I've seen them plant some ground covers before, and I believe they used I forget what they used. It wasn't a Lantana. Maybe it was Lantana. I've seen them use Lantana as a ground cover in certain areas, and those plants on a steep slope are pretty close together because they did want to avoid any type of erosion. So they had to spend more money, more plants, higher install cost, and those plants that were placed close together. But the steeper the slope, more quickly you need to get that covered to prevent erosion. So you are going to have a higher cost if you're trying to do it on a slope. Now, if you've just got a level area, maybe in your yard around an oak tree or something like that, you can kind of back off a little bit, but the plants can be further apart at the initial planting. Again, we're talking about maybe that 12 to 18 inches at the initial planting. And again, of course, it does take longer for plant material to become fully established. But, that is a benefit because, again, in the end, less plants, lower install costs. And again, we talked about cost of plant material has skyrocketed in the last year or so. So that's something just to think about when you are putting it in, whether you're doing it or you're having it done professionally. So think about things like that, may dictate how much you want to spend on planting, because if it is going to take double the amount of plant material, you may want to think about something else. One more section I'm talking about ground cover planting. And I put this in here, raised beds or container areas. A lot of times we may have, again, a water fountain or a raised bed, maybe around a tree, or maybe it's a raised bed out in the yard or maybe next to the house. Those areas may need a little bit of special attention. Again, we need to talk about the soil. If it's a raised bed or it's a new construction, or maybe you have like a terraced area in your yard, something like that is been built up, you need to think about the soil considerations. If it was basically built and then you had to backfill it with material, the material that they backfilled it with may be just inadequate. It may be just rock and gravel. So you may have to go in there and add soil for that area to be efficient and to grow properly. Nothing is more frustrating than trying to plant something in basically a field dirt or a clay soil that maybe just used as a filler and has very little nutrient in it. And basically it's just riprap kind of type material. So you may need to go in there and add soil as well. Also, we need to think about water requirements for raised beds if they're in a raised location. A lot of times we don't think about that. And a lot of times these little planter beds or something, decorative, they tend to dry out very quickly. So you may have to run an additional water hose to them or a drip irrigation line or something so that they do get some supplemental irrigation from time to time. Otherwise, you'll be dragging a water hose or a sprinkler out there trying to, save those plants. But that's something to think about either when you're building it or during construction or before you definitely go out there and plant, because none of us like to drag the water hose out there and the sprinklers to have to, water certain areas just because they dry out very quickly. One thing we talk about, water requirements, and even it doesn't have to be a raised bed, but a lot of times I'll see beds kind of in a concrete island out there in the middle of the parking lot. And those probably are the world's worst for struggling and stressing, because basically, you've got an area where maybe in the middle of a parking lot, maybe there may be a little tree and they'll plant a ground cover in that so they don't have to go out there and mow it. Basically, if you're a plant island in the middle of a sea of hot asphalt or hot concrete, those temperatures out there get extremely hot very quickly. And that soil in those little raised beds with the little medians that you see out there at the strip malls or maybe the shopping centers, sometimes the ground cover looks pretty pitiful because it's struggling because they didn't bring any fill back into those beds, and basically it was just the clay or the shale that they put in the parking lot, and they may have just sprinkled some topsoil on there, and it gets very hot, very dry, very quickly. Uh-oh, what happened? I think we had a snafu. Hang on one second. All right, let's see if I can make it work again. I'm sorry about this. Okay. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. All right, so let's talk about ground cover fertilization real quick. So after the initial fertilization at planting, you may need to fertilize on an as-needed basis. I put in here 2 different types of fertilization. Most common is our granular fertilizer. You want to do this upon getting your ground cover started. You can use like a 15-5-10 granular or a slow release type product. That works pretty well, just like you would do your lawn. Or you may want to use a water soluble system. Basically, this is fertigation through your hose-in system. A lot of us use that for, greening up an area very quickly. Either of those is acceptable when you're getting a ground cover plot established, but you do need to make sure that you do fertilize that upon establishment to give it a good start and kind of go from there. So mulching, and you would think, well, I'm planting a ground cover. Why do I need to mulch? Basically, if you're starting a ground cover, the ground cover goal is to, keep the weeds down. But if you're planting a new establishment, you're going to have some space in there, and you guys know as well as I do, if you don't mulch it, you're going to have some weeds, and we don't want the weeds to take over and then choke out the ground covers. And sometimes we see that. If they don't do a good job of mulching those ground covers when they're started, the weeds do get established, or they didn't do a good job of preparation of the bed itself, and they left a lot of weeds in there to get started. You can have some issues. So I always recommend a 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch in any landscape bed that you're going to do, whether it be a small one or a large one. Obviously, it aids in weed control and moisture retention, but nothing is more frustrating trying to pull weeds out of a ground cover bed, because sometimes you don't know which is the ground cover and which is the weed, because they do get so aggressive sometimes. But if you are going to use a mulch, any type of mulch is good. Depending on your location, you can use like a pine bark or hardwood, a decomposed layer of leaves. I have found that pine needles, pine straw works really great in my area. Folks further down the coast may not have access to pine straw, or maybe the pine bark, but you may have more of a hardwood bark. That's fine. You just want something that's going to decompose and break down and basically add nutrient back into the soil, but also keep the ground, again, moist and keep the weeds from getting out of control until you get established type of retention. So trimming of ground covers, and this goes back to my maintenance thing, and we talked about this in so many ways that y'all probably think I'm going to beat this one to death. But I put in here some ground covers can become aggressive and escape their selected areas. We've seen it, and we know what we're talking. Some of them probably just shaking your head. It's like, I never will have that again. Or, it's so ferocious, I just don't even want to think about it. So some ground covers need to be trimmed every year. And we put on here certain ground varieties may benefit from yearly pruning for maximum effectiveness of growth and development. Again, if we keep some of them sheared, they will come back, thicker and fuller. But a lot of our ground covers, again, tend to creep and grow out of bounds. So we do have to keep them pruned to keep them going, kind of keep them from overtaking, the surrounding areas. Watering of ground covers, we talked about this a while ago a little bit, but I would make sure they get a good establishment of water the first year. It's just like establishing a lawn. Planting is critical. You need to make sure they're watered during the initial planting, especially if it's been hot and dry. If you're doing this, during the summer, give those ground cover plants a good soaking to prevent any drying out. And we always talk about, deep watering. Same thing with plants on which ground covers are based. We want deep waterings, and we don't want the shallow rooted type waterings where basically the plant dries out very quickly if it gets hot, because they will stress, and then that's quality plant will not go from there. All right, insects and disease, not usually an issue in ground covers. If there is an issue, always identify the problem insect. Sometimes it's insect maybe chewing on it or something like that. If it is a weed, you may want to spray a recommended weed killer, but you do have to be careful, because a lot of times if you spray a weed killer on a ground cover as well, you may damage it as well. So make sure that it is approved. Same thing with insects, pesticides. If you have a question, always visit with the extension agent or someone like that to make sure that it will not harm that ground cover, which you're trying to get rid of, whether it be a chewing insect or something like that. And then, as we say, always follow all recommended guidelines for product usage. We always say the label is the law, so be sure that you do follow that label as well. All right, so here's a list of what I put together of common ground covers for Southeast Texas. And we're going to go through these here in just a minute, but this is not an inclusive list. This is just ones that I know that I've seen and probably have either planted myself or maintained or found really good examples of in our area. So, but these are basically guaranteed to do well in our area. Some of them are annual, some of them are perennials. So basically there's a good assortment, and we're going to go through and look at a couple of examples of these guys and just kind of go from there. All right, so the first one that we took pictures of is English ivy. So it is adapted on most locations. Probably does well in zones about 4 through 9, maybe a little bit further south. It may go further north just a little bit. Low maintenance, an occasional trimming to keep in place. And I put on here, can be considered a nuisance if not managed. I probably should have rewritten that and said that this is a major plant that if left to escape, it will overtake anything. It likes to climb. I used to live in a house that had English ivy growing on a tree, and for some reason it escaped, so to speak, and kind of got away from us, and it grew up a brick wall, and it ended up covering a side of a house. It went in the eaves and the attic. So if you have it in a natural setting, that's fine. Just be sure you can trim it back occasionally and keep it in control, because if left untamed, it can get very aggressive and it will climb and attach to whatever it likes. Now, there is a variegated variety of this as well in the lower right-hand corner. But again, from my growing up this as a child, this was just ferocious. We didn't ever have to mow but on that side of the house. But again, it was on a slope and it crawled up a sweet gum tree. But it will basically choke out small trees and climb because it does like to wander, so to speak. But in a contained area, I think this is a good material to use. But again, it can be aggressive. So just plant that in the back of your mind, knowing that it can escape if you're not careful. All right, this one is called Ajuga. It's got several names, but Ajuga is probably one of the more common names. It's also called carpet bugle or bugle weed. This is a very low-growing ground cover, really grown for the foliage. It's got a purple foliage to it. This is a herbaceous perennial. In the winter times, if we have a mild winter, it may last, but if it's really cold, it may kind of die back a little bit. I would say this one is full sun to partial shade. It likes the full sun, but it'll tolerate a little bit of shady area. If you're just looking for a alternative to, non-traditional grass, this may be your option, because you can actually set your mower pretty high and just run over this occasionally and keep it in check. It's a very low-growing form of a plant. It spreads by stolons. There are some variegated varieties available, but I think most people grow it simply for the purple type foliage, and it is, like I said, it will colonize an area very quickly. Again, this one that may want to creep out if you don't keep it in check. Normally you can just pull up the ones you don't want early in the spring and kind of keep it in check that way. But this is Ajuga. So this is a really good ground cover if you just kind of got a semi-shady location. All right, I threw this one in here. Some people may disagree, and this is not really a ground cover, but it is. I call it a climbing ground cover. It does like to climb and vine, but this is one of the ones that does get a little bit taller if you let it on its own. But again, you see it in the picture. It basically will engulf any type of structure that it's on, and it is a very fragrant flower in the springtime. Easily propagated by cuttings. It does like full sun or part shade. I had a neighbor at one time that had a chain link fence, and basically within about 2.5 years, he had planted a couple of plants along the base of the chain link, and within that time, it basically covered that chain link fence to where basically you could not see through it. It's such a dense grower and climber. But again, they come back with a weed trimmer periodically and just kind of give it a haircut, and it's quite happy. So it will. This is a climber type vine, but it will, also trail on the ground as well. So this may be an option if you have a trellis or something like that you want to use as a screen, or maybe as a large ground cover area. But this is a very versatile plant. Again, fragrant in the springtime. All right. Here is one that I know we all have seen, probably overly used, but again, something that we see in our area. And this is Asian jasmine. I put full sun to partial shade. It needs a little bit of shade in southern climates, so it will handle a little bit of shade underneath some trees. Growing height is anywhere from 3 to 10 inches. And I put this one on here, aggressive growth if not contained. Usually what happens is the landscape guys or homeowners will take a weed eater and just basically give it a haircut along the edges to keep it growing off the sidewalk or maybe over the curb. This is probably one that we have all seen at the strip malls or something like that, or the little island beds. And the reason that they plant it is it does grow fast. It's a very dense ground cover. Once established, you really don't have an issue with weeds. It's a fast grower. This is probably one that you can do in 4-inch cups, a foot apart, and it will fill in by next year. There are some variegated varieties available. They haven't ever caught on that I've seen, but there are some red and yellow variations in color. But again, this is probably one of the most commonly used types of ground covers that we have out there. The reason they use it's hardy. I will say this, plant this with the knowing that it will be hard to get rid of if you ever decide to eradicate it. It does take a little bit of extra effort. We always seem to get calls on flower beds that have this in it, and they've creeped into the shrubs and things like that, and the homeowners want them gone. It can be removed, but it is a little bit more cumbersome to remove because you do have to use a different type of herbicide to remove it. Simply a glyphosate just won't kill this if you're trying to eradicate it. So just keep that in mind and keep it kind of in check, because it does want to tend to climb, and it will choke out adjoining trees and especially shrubs if you're not careful. But overall, still a good ground cover. All right, here's some of our junipers. We don't use a lot of junipers in this area as a rule, but maybe in the different parts of the country, maybe the northwest, they do use a lot of juniper ground covers. And if you look at the name, Junipers horizontalis, however you want to say that, I think that name is pretty descriptive. It's a creeping or a spreading ground cover. They have a lot of adaptability. They can go basically from, again, the northern part of the United States almost to the coast. A lot of times they grow strictly for the foliage. It's either a light green or maybe a dark green. Sometimes they have like a blue-gray color to them. Really good ground cover. Drought tolerant in most cases. But again, given our location here in Southeast Texas, probably would not be the first choice because it does need a well-drained location in our locations. And sometimes here in Southeast Texas, we are not the most well-drained area in part of the world, just due to all our rainfall that we get. So If you have a hot, maybe dry, sunny location, I see a lot of this maybe used out in the southwest part of the United States, just simply because it is a tolerant of some drier conditions. But a good option if you like the ground cover that kind of creeps and stays low to the ground. Most of this material, again, stays about anywhere from 6 to 12, 18 inches off the ground. So that's a good ground cover height as well. It's a good option. Let's see. All right. Now, I put Lantana on here as a ground cover. I think Ginger did a program here maybe a couple of weeks ago on talking about all the different types of Lantana. And if you're going to use one for ground cover, you need to make sure that it is a trailing type of ground cover. I think Lantana is one of those that is, we treat it as a perennial. Basically, mine comes back year after year, but during the wintertime, it is kind of bare. And I usually trim mine back in the wintertime after all the growth is gone. But again, full sun for better results. It will tolerate a little bit of shade, but mostly full sun. Well-drained soil. It doesn't like to sit in the wet, soggy soils. 12 to 18 inches is about all mine will get, but there are multiple colors. You usually see it in the pink and the purple, maybe some blues. The yellow Lantana, that new gold, is more of a mounding type material, but it's also used for ground covers. And this is one that you can be pretty aggressive with in trimming. You can usually cut this back with a weed eater or set your mower very, very high early in the season, and it can handle a lot of abuse. The only drawback about this guy is that they can be prone to aphids, lace bugs, or mite damage. So sometimes we do have to spray the Lantanas periodically with a little bit of pesticide for pesticide damage. But again, if you keep it under control, they're usually pretty good. But again, this is a good summertime color option if you're looking for a ground cover. This is one of our more of our colorful varieties of ground covers that we can really grow. All right, the next one is Lariopi. I know we've all seen this. It's probably one of the more commonly used types of ground covers. We use it primarily as a border or an edging, but it can be planted in mass plantings as well. It is a herbaceous perennial. It usually doesn't die back in our area. There's two different varieties. There's usually a more of a spiked kind or more of a shallow kind, depending on the variety. It also comes in a variegated form. This is a really neat little plant if you've got need to cover a large area. And it creeps by stolons as well. So basically you plant one clump and basically it'll creep and spread. But again, it's always been good to use as a border. A lot of times we use it as a border planting within our flower beds. Maintenance wise, shear it just once a year or so and it'll come right back. Anyway, it usually puts out spikes of the purple or blue flowers. In our area, this is a very common plant as well. Again, we see it primarily as a border edging, but again, it can be planted in mass plantings in your beds as well. All right, here's its cousin that we always think about. The two kind of go hand in hand, and most people, depending if they're not sure, they may interchange them. But this is what we call Mondo or monkey grass. This doesn't put any blooms on that are significant. It makes a little small white flower. It's kind of an ugly little white flower, to be honest with you, but really a good ground cover alternative. It has a darker color, spiked plant leaf, but it does cover very quickly. And it can be full sun, but it will tolerate quite a bit of shade. And again, this is probably one of the more common types of ground covers that we normally see here in Southeast Texas. And again, most times they plant this in little 4-inch cups, and then it spreads very quickly. But again, it's more of a clumping type of grass, but it does spread. Plumbago. Most of us don't think of it as a ground cover, but absolutely a ground cover here in this area. It spreads very quickly. Again, it is one of the deciduous perennials. About 12 to 18 inches at full height. And I would say on this guy, for maximum effectiveness and color, you're going to want to plant this in full sun, maybe afternoon shade. but does well here in our area, zone 6 to 9. I don't know how much further north it would go, but in our area, Plumbago probably is a good option for a ground cover if you have a small area. All right, here's one that we don't think of very often. Sometimes this is even a house plant, but this is a little type of begonia. It's called a Strawberry Begonia. Again, I see a lot of people selling this as more of a containerized house plant, and it does well in either situation. But partial shade to a filtered sun on this guy, again, since it's a begonia, the leaves will tend to burn just a little bit. But again, it will cover an area and spread very quickly. It does have little spikes that are either white or pink. They get about a foot or so above the top of the plant. I normally don't even worry about the spikes of flowers. They're usually not that pretty to me, but basically I grow it for the variegation on the leaf structure, and it will kind of grow very quickly. But again, you'll see this sometimes as a house plant or in a container, or it can actually be in the ground as well. So a good multi-use type plant as well. All right, I put this one on here. This is our traditional, what we call cast iron plant. You may not think of this as a ground cover, but in my way of thinking, why not? It does what it's supposed to do for a ground cover. It fills in, it covers an area. It's hardy. It does not a fast grower. A lot of times we see these ringed around trees, or we'll see beds of these kind of around trees. This is not your fill it and forget it type plant. It's a very slow grower, so you've usually been there quite a while. There are some variegated varieties available, but most of them are usually that dark green. The ones on the top are fairly young. I think that's why they're so light green. But again, this is one that gets rather tall if you let it. It can get up to about 2 feet tall. So if you're looking for that non-traditional low-lying ground cover, this is not it. This is more of a tall, woody type ground cover, but really good in a woodland type setting. So definitely something you might want to think about. All right. Now I threw this one in here just because I like sweet potato vine, and I think this is probably one of the most commonly overused plants, but I think it's good for a reason. It is an annual ground cover. We treat it as an annual. Again, you can grow this in a hanging basket, but in our area, we can actually do it as a ground cover. Wide range of colors, anywhere from that chartreuse to that dark purple. Leaf margins are something really different on these things. They can have either a trilobed or they can have a very serrated edge. You get varieties like Marguerite, which I think is a dark color, or the chartreuse, or I think it's a chartreuse one, the green one. Pretty different plant. It does like the sun, but it'll tolerate a little bit of shade, mostly sun location. Pretty aggressive in growth habit. And I put on here, 6 to 15 inches in height, but can spread to a length of about 10 foot. Again, this is an annual type plant, so simply just take your weed eater or your string trimmer or your shears and just shear it back into shape. The more you shear it, the more aggressive it gets. And again, I put on here, can be aggressive in your coverage in good conditions. I use this quite a bit in the landscape and things like that because it's a quick filler. If you've got some shrubs that are very colorful or something like that, this fills in a lot of area very quickly. And if you have a large area to cover, this would be what you want to use on a yearly basis if you don't mind replanting. But again, remember, this is an annual type plant, so very aggressive in its growth. All right, this is Woodelia. It is a ground cover. We do have some at our demonstration garden there. And again, I thought this was one that probably bit the dust this year. It was very slow to come back, but ours has come back. We don't have a big area of it, maybe just about a 4 by 6 foot area of it, but it came back from the freeze because it basically was just a clump of brown, and we pruned it back, but we were kind of hesitant about it, living through the freeze and the frost, but it did live. It's come back. It's great little ground cover. Has little yellow flowers on it, so if you have it in a dark woodland setting or with a lot of shrubs, it does a good job of kind of standing out, and it is a good ground cover as well. Has little small yellow clusters of flowers that I think do stand out from a distance. But again, very good southern type of plant for zones 8 through 11. All right, probably one that we don't think about being the fern. This is actually a wood fern. Sometimes it's called a Christmas fern or things like that. We treat them as a perennial. And if you're looking for a very shady location, this is it. It does like a lot of shade. Will tolerate a moist environment. Growth habits upright 1 to 3 feet. Again, this is not your traditional low-lying, creeping type fern, but one that basically will colonize and through clumps and through division. So if you have a real shady area in your landscape, this might be something you want to think about. I think this is either the last one or next to the last one. This is Vinca. Call it Vinca Minor. It's kind of kin to the periwinkle. Looks to me like a lot of periwinkle, but this is one that does well in Southeast Texas. Good ground cover, dark, dense foliage. Has pretty little blue to blue snowy white flowers that bloom in late spring. And it's very aggressive in its growth. And if you let it kind of get wild, it will kind of, take over a hillside, you can see in the bottom picture. But again, you can shear this back, and it does a really good job. Keeps a moderate height, and it's a good ground cover if you need to cover an area very quickly. Oh, I forgot this may be the last one. This is one that I have found that I've used in the last couple of years as well. It's called Japanese Artesia. It is a woody type ground cover. Reminds me of Asian jasmine, but the foliage is a little more glossier, and it does make a pretty little red berry in the spring or fall. I'm sorry, in the fall. You can either get it in a waxy green color, or you can have it in a variegated form as well. But it is a woody type ground cover, a little bit slower to grow and fill in areas, but it will handle some shade, and it does a really good setting if you have a lot of tree canopy and dense, dense areas as well. But this is something that if you do like to attract a lot of the wildlife and have a little bit of color in the fall as well, this one does make a nice little red fruit as well. All right, that's all I had question-wise. So I hope this was something informative on ground covers. Like Kevin mentioned earlier, we're not going to have a program on September the 1st. I think we all have something to do that day. But again, on the 15th, Ginger with Aransas County will be talking about landscaping with natives. So we wish that you would come back and kind of go from there. And that's really all I have. We'll open it up for discussions real quick. Let me stop sharing my screen. All right. So, Kevin, do we have any questions?
We had one question. We answered it in the chat. It was about what the term annual meant as far as a ground cover, and she already understood it. She just says ground cover, it doesn't come back each year, and I just clarified, yes, that's what it means.
Yes. Sorry, I did not clarify that. Does anyone have any other questions that they may have or think about? I know this was a very quick run through, things like that, but hopefully this kind of gave you some ideas on maybe some different ones that you may be able to utilize in your landscape and, a location. But again, I call it alternatives to mowing. Sometimes if you choose the wrong one, it may require more maintenance. So we always try to make sure that you guys get the right plant for the right location, and hopefully it makes your landscape better and your maintenance less. I'm all about the less maintenance nowadays with time constraints. So,
question about mint and oregano. Can they be used as ground covers?
I would say yes, in a small location-wise. We actually have some in our demonstration garden that I think would qualify as a ground cover because it does spread very quickly. We have it mulched pretty heavily with, again, the pine straw. But I would say yes, in a small location. You can treat it as a ground cover, especially the mint. I think we have one variety that likes to, grow pretty rapidly, and we have to kind of keep it in check. So I would say yes, in a given location. depending on what you're using it for, it could be considered a ground cover. Good question.
And there are lots of different kinds of mints as well. So
yes, there are. Every flavor and variety under the sun, you think of it as probably a mint flavor or mint variety.
right. I don't think we have any more questions coming in, David. Good job, and appreciate everything that you had to present today.
Absolutely. Well, guys, thank y'all very much for joining us this morning. We appreciate everyone getting on. Again, if you guys do have questions, my contact information, well, it went away. But again, if you do have questions, please feel free to contact us. We'll be happy to answer any questions. There it is. They're not seeing that. Let me share that. There. But that's my email and phone number. If you guys do have questions, any of the agents on here would be happy to answer your questions. So with that, if there are no more questions, guys, thank you very much for taking time out of your day. And again, you should get a survey here in just a little bit from me, quality-wise. Just take a minute or two to evaluate that and go from there. But if you don't have any questions, then I think we're all good.